welcome back to my channel. My name is Carly Stevens. I'm the author of the young adult fantasy Firian Rising, and this is English Nerd. So, of course, we're in the middle of a series all about A Tale of Two Cities, and today's chapters will be Book 2, chapters 7 and 8. So that is Monseigneur in town and then Monseigneur in the country. These chapters, when I first read them as a sophomore in high school, were not my favorite chapters. But there is a lot to glean from them if we focus on the right things. So let's begin. So chapter 7, Monseigneur in town. Monseigneur is never actually named at the beginning of this chapter. Instead, he's just referred to as Monseigneur. He's like a class of people. This is what the upper class is like. We've seen the lower class in the wine shop chapter before, when they were scraping up wine from the streets with their hands. And then here we get a glimpse of the upper class as a whole. So Monseigneur, it says, one of the great lords in power at the court, held his fortnightly reception in his grand hotel in Paris. Monseigneur was in his inner room, his sanctuary of sanctuaries, the holiest of holiests, to the crowd of worshippers in the suite of rooms without. This language is super loaded. The diction, the word choice here is clearly meant to sound godlike. He thinks of himself as this godlike figure. The upper class thinks of themselves as deities, essentially. Later in the chapter, it even says, "The earth and the fullness thereof are mine, saith Monseigneur." That's basically a Bible verse. It's from the Psalms that refers to God, not to this upper class guy. So right away we get the sense that their sense of self-importance is overblown, and so it shouldn't surprise us too much when we go into this next section, which I find kind of funny. It's meant to be satire, but anyway, it says that the morning's hot chocolate could not so much as get into the throat of Monseigneur without the aid of 4 strong men besides the cook. Yes, it took 4 men. And then Dickens elaborates that one is the froths the milk and one gets the napkin. And so it takes 4 people to get this man his hot chocolate. And it says that if his hot chocolate had been ignobly waited on by only 3 men, he would have just been completely ashamed. He must have died of 2. The divide is not just kind of a divide between the upper and the lower classes. It's a crazy, gigantic divide between the two. Some are scraping up wine with their fingers. Others are taking 4 servants just to get hot chocolate, which is extra, into their mouths. So, kind of skipping ahead a little bit here, we have a lot of satirizing of the upper classes in Paris, and so a lot of it's justified, it seems to me. I have seen the palace at Versailles, which is not in Paris, but kind of indicative of the grandeur of the upper class at that time, and it was almost offensively lavish. Now, I like super over-the-top, beautiful, expensive things, like I think anybody does to a certain degree, at times anyway, but anything that could be gilded or carved into a beautiful statue had been, to the point where there was no place to relax. I'm thinking about the royal family that lived in Versailles, in the palace there. There was no place to relax at all. Everything felt like this museum of unlimited wealth. And so, Dickens was right to criticize them, considering how the other half was not even getting a fraction of that care and the money. Okay, so at the end of all of this satire on the upper class, we have one person who's left in this soiree, this party, who leaves and says about the Monseigneur, "I devote you," said this person, stopping on the last door on his way and turning in the direction of the sanctuary, right where the Monseigneur is, "to the devil." And then he leaves. This is the Marquis. So When I first read this, I thought that the Monseigneur and the Marquis were the same person. I just wasn't reading closely enough. The Monseigneur is somebody who is actually above even the Marquis, who has, within his own little realm, we'll see, basically unlimited power there. The Marquis is jealous of the Monseigneur and how he has even more than he does. So we follow the Marquis. The Marquis is the actual important one. He has a name. He's the Marquis St. Evremonde. So he goes just tearing through the streets of Paris to get to his chateau. And it says, at last, swooping at a street corner by a fountain, one of its wheels, the carriage, came to a sickening little jolt, and there was a loud cry from a number of voices, and the horses reared and plunged. But for the latter inconvenience, the carriage probably would not have stopped. It's clear that he's run over someone or something, and everybody is gasping and crying out, and it's only that the horses were kind of spooked. It's that inconvenience that makes the Marquis stop. He is inhuman in his lack of care for other people. Utterly inhuman. So, what has gone wrong? Said Monsieur, calmly looking out. And then a tall man catches up this bundle that's down at the foot of this fountain and that's been run over and is just crying. It's important that this is a tall man. The only other tall man that we've heard about is the one in the wine shop chapter who wrote Blood on the Wall with the wine. His name is Gaspard. He's the only one who's really ever referred to as tall. So if you're reading along in this book for the first time, just keep your eyes open for anyone who's described as tall, and it will be Gaspard, the friend of Monsieur Defarge. So the Marquis has run over a child and killed a kid. Yet his question is this. Why does the man make that abominable noise? Is it his child? A couple things stand out to me here. Is it his child? He refers to the child not as a person, but as a thing. Is it his child? And he doesn't even understand why Gaspard is crying over the death of his son. I mean, the Marquis clearly doesn't even think about these lower class people as being human at all. So his solution to all of this is to try to pay for the kid. He's like, it's extraordinary to me that you can't take care of yourselves and your children. Just take this, and then he throws this coin out the window as though you can just break it and buy it. You know, he's wealthy enough to just make it go away. But that's not how human life works, of course. And then Defarge shows up. Actually, both of the Defarges by the end of the chapter. So Monsieur Defarge comes in and encourages Gaspard. We can see him being a leader in this tragic situation. He puts his arm around him and says, maybe it's better this way. Think about the lives that we live. Did you really want that for your son? Interestingly, Defarge also calls his son an it. It has died happily in a moment without pain. Could it have lived an hour as happily? Defarge is doing much more human things and comforting the father and all of that. But there's this bit of dehumanization even with Monsieur Defarge here. And the Marquis kind of likes Defarge. I think he's amused by how he's being philosophical about the whole thing and not carrying on like some of the other, people. And so the Marquis throws him a coin as well, just for being interesting. And then we get this nice moment. Monsieur the Marquis leaned back in his seat and was just being driven away with the air of a gentleman who had accidentally broken some common thing and had paid for it and could afford to pay for it, when his ease was suddenly disturbed by a coin flying into his carriage and ringing on the floor. I like that. He deserves to have a coin thrown in his face. He deserves more than that, but he deserves to have that coin thrown in his face. When he looks out the window, Defarge is gone, and Madame Defarge stands where he once did. So it's unclear which of the two of them threw the coin. My guess is Defarge, because he is no longer there. But Madame Defarge is there, and she's knitting. And she has a good moment here. One of her first good, interesting moments. The Marquis starts yelling at everybody, how dare you? Who threw that coin? I'll get even with him. and nobody can even look him in the eye because they know that he has the power to kill them or throw them in prison or without a trial, anything like that. Among the men, it says, not one. But the woman who stood knitting looked up steadily and looked the Marquis in the face. I like Madame Defarge here. I think she's just so tough. She won't back down. She's just knitting and she's just looking at him. And then the chapter ends saying that the one woman still knits at the end of the chapter with the steadfastness of fate. Now, if you were watching the wine shop video and wondering, like, really, is Madame Defarge like a fate? Seems like you're stretching that pretty far. She sees nothing. She knits sometimes. Fair. Here is some additional evidence to show that Dickens is meaning to connect the mythological fates to Madame Defarge. She knits with the steadfastness of fate. There's less to say about Chapter 8. I just want to touch on a couple things. Chapter 8, Monseigneur in the Country. It's still called Monseigneur in the Country, from my understanding, because Dickens is still trying to make a comment about the class, the upper class in general, now through the Marquis St. Evremonde, how he ran over the child, and then how he refuses to create a grave for this woman, and he's just generally being cruel as he's going through the land. There are only really two important things about this chapter. One, we meet the mender of roads, who seems like a teeny insubstantial character, but he comes up a lot in this story in significant ways, so it's important to remember the mender of roads. The mender of roads is staring weirdly at the carriage, and so the Marquis stops and says, "Okay, what are you staring at?" And the mender of roads says, "I looked at the man. He swung by the chain of the shoe, the drag, and he was whiter than the miller, all covered with dust, white as a spectre, tall as a spectre." And the mender of roads is acting this whole thing out the whole time because that's how he likes to tell stories. He's like, he was hanging this way underneath the carriage, and then he ran off. So since he's tall as a spectre, we know who this has to be, right? There's only one person who's regularly described as tall, one person who would have really good motive to be hanging on to the carriage and following the Marquis to the end, to his chateau. But the man runs off before they're able to catch him. So the Marquis arrives at his chateau, and we get the bombshell. This is where you can see how this story was published serially, how it was published in installments. This was a really nice episode cut off, I think, when the Marquis asks, "Monsieur Charles, whom I expect, is he arrived from England?" "Monseigneur, not yet." So Charles Darnay knows this monster of a man somehow, and that's who the Marquis is going to meet. So it's meant to be, cue the dramatic music, dun dun dun. How do they know each other? So we find out in the next chapter. But that's it for chapters 7 and 8. Hopefully, even if you've read this book a lot of times, hopefully you got something new out of it. Just as a little added bonus here at the end, here's a Fizz illustration of the stoppage at the fountain, where you can see the little boy who's been run over there on the left-hand side, and then Gaspard and the carriage and most of the other actions happening on the other side of the picture. But there you go. Make sure to subscribe if you haven't already. Like this video if you like it, and I'll see you very soon. Bye.